In February 2022, you had to endure the nightmare that you didn't even know if your government was going to survive overnight when Russian special forces were at Hostomel Airport and were threatening to go into the capital. And there were people who I was talking to on that night when those Russian special forces were in Hostomel who said, we think Kyiv will fall within a few weeks. And you know what? The famous part of this is that President Zelensky said, I don't need a tank, I need weapons, I need ammunition. But here's the bigger part for me. Ukrainian people said the same thing. Many of them had to leave the country, but many of them stayed and they did not give up. And so I can't tell you when this invasion will end, but I can tell you that having witnessed 47 months of it, Ukraine still stands, its government still stands, and most importantly, its people still stand.
Joining us today, Scott Lucas, Professor of International Politics at the University College Dublin's Clinton Institute. Welcome to our program, Professor Lucas.
Oh, thank you. It's always such a pleasure to see both of you.
Thank you, likewise. Russian oil prices have fallen to their lowest levels since the war began, to roughly $40 per barrel. Meanwhile, US is preparing another round of sanctions against Russian energy sector should Vladimir Putin reject the US offer on a ceasefire in Ukraine. Should Russians be concerned about this new drop in oil prices?
No, they will pretend they are not concerned in the Kremlin, but yes, of course they are concerned here, because even before this latest drop, which, as you mentioned, is now Russian oil prices at their Russian oil revenues at their lowest level since 2020, at the time of the pandemic. The revenues were down 33% since January. It's projected they could be down almost 50% by the end of the year. Now, a couple of those factors are general and might change. For example, the global oil price had been decreasing. It has increased in recent days because of U.S. threats against Venezuela. That might help the Russians a little bit. But the broader picture is the combination of the U.S. sanctions on Russia's oil companies, notably Lukoil and Rosneft, and the customers of those companies, China, India, and Turkey being the three largest, and also Ukraine's drone attacks and attacks with other long-range weapons against oil refineries, amongst other installations. So the Russians are having to increase the discount they give to customers to keep buying oil, if they keep buying oil. And just a couple of reminders, 6 of India's 7 largest refiners either suspended or cut their purchases of Russian oil in December. Turkey's purchases had dropped by at least a third. China's purchases had dropped by at least 36%. And this could be a long-term drop. What will save Russia, and this will tie into other issues I think we'll discuss today, would be if the Trump administration reversed and lifted the sanctions. Because, of course, if they lifted the sanctions, then the risk to China, India, Turkey from secondary measures recedes, maybe even disappears, and they might increase the volumes of Russian oil they take. I will add one other factor to watch, because Ukraine is now hitting Russian tankers. There is another tanker that was struck overnight, I believe. Certainly that's what Ukrainian officials are claiming. That, I believe, is the 5th tanker that's been struck in the past 2 to 3 weeks. And of course, if you strike the tankers carrying the oil, it affects Russia's capacity to carry the oil, or at the very least, it increases the cost for them to carry their oil.
Let's also cover another offer from US to Ukraine, this Article 5-like security guarantee. US is offering Ukraine a security guarantee, so-called security guarantee, like Article 5. It's the strongest offer so far. However, this offer is limited in time, according to Politico, because the US warns that future security guarantee offers may be less generous. Is this a take or leave offer?
I want to shift this a little bit because there's a wider perspective that I think is important because it also brings in the Europeans. We had talks last weekend in Berlin, which included, obviously, Ukrainian officials, including President Zelensky, European leaders, very important leaders. Germany's Friedrich Merz was there, for example. And then you have the Americans who are there. And interestingly, it's the American envoys who had been working with the Kremlin. It's the real estate developer, Steve Witkoff. It's Donald Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner. And your viewers will remember that it was less than 2 months ago that Witkoff and Kushner were working with Vladimir Putin's top official, Kirill Dmitriev, on an ultimatum against Ukraine. There were no firm security guarantees. Ukraine was being asked to give up territory, notably the rest of the Donetsk region. Western assistance was to be curtailed. Ukraine's military was to be limited. Now, and this is why I emphasize the Europeans and Ukraine have been maneuvering, including contact with Trump officials who actually support them. And again, I think I would point to Secretary of State Marco Rubio. Said, look, let's get a better proposal here. And the better proposal includes, for example, a ceasefire on current front lines, so Ukraine does not have to withdraw from Donetsk. Now, that's still an open issue. President Zelensky just said it was an open issue earlier today. But on the issue of security guarantees, now what we have is, for the first time, is a detailed approach to what would be needed to protect against a future Russian invasion. So the Europeans, and again, I think you have to start with them, are saying they will make the commitment to put their forces into Ukraine, both to monitor a ceasefire and to provide assistance if Ukraine was attacked again. Now, that's a huge step forward. Europe's also going to provide advice to Ukrainian forces. That will include intelligence, that will include logistics, that will include transport. The Americans will provide support for the security guarantees at distance. In other words, it looks like it'll be a U.S.-led air protection force. And of course, Ukraine has not had a sizable air force. They've been outgunned by Russia all through this invasion. Now the Americans are coming in, probably with air power, which would be based in somewhere like Poland. That would be my guess, or maybe Romania. Now, that's a big security guarantee that President Zelensky has been seeking all year long, despite the problems with the Trump administration. Now he's got it. And again, it's interesting today that out of those, he identified 3 issues that remain after those Berlin talks. He said, okay, we still have the issue of the Donbass, the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. We still have the issue of the reparations loan to help Ukraine cover its financial needs. Now, that's primarily a European Union issue, which is being discussed today and tomorrow, and we may get a resolution on that tomorrow. And then thirdly, we need to agree the status of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, where Ukraine effectively continues to control it, and it's not split control amongst the Americans, the Russians, and Ukrainians. Now, you'll notice he did not mention security guarantees as an issue still to be decided. So you have that guarantee, and the shorthand for it is a NATO Article 5-like guarantee. Ukraine is not a member of NATO, but this is a guarantee that is similar to one that a NATO member gets from other NATO members if it's attacked. That's a huge step forward. And I would not have expected it with Witkoff and Kushner. That indicates there are other U.S. officials who are working with Ukraine on this. Now, that quote you gave from Politico is important because there are still U.S. officials that are putting pressure on Ukraine, a lot of pressure on Ukraine. And they tend to be from the camp around Donald Trump because they say, we have to have this agreement by Christmas. Remember Trump, he wanted it within 24 hours, didn't happen. He said it would happen this summer, didn't happen. He wanted it by Thanksgiving, late November, didn't happen. Now he wants it by Christmas. So the people around Trump are saying, come on, Ukraine, you've got to agree to this. In other words, if you have doubts about other issues, beyond the security guarantees. And again, the status of Donetsk is the key one. Can't you just give up? Can't you just back away a little bit from this? I don't think Ukraine will back away. I think Ukraine and Europe has set their lines down. But we will see probably what happens this weekend, because it's being reported that we've got two sets of meetings. It's being reported that Witkoff and Kushner will be meeting their old friend, Vladimir Putin's advisor, Kirill Dmitriev, in Florida. But it's also being reported that Ukrainian officials are going to the United States. Now, does that mean we're going to get indirect talks with the Americans moving between Ukraine and Russia for the first time? That's something to watch. Maybe we're getting ahead of ourselves here. Fundamental here is Vladimir Putin still is not accepting a ceasefire. He's still continuing the invasion, but Ukraine's got those security guarantees. That's a huge step forward.
Let's also cover the biggest unresolved question, Donbas region. President Zelensky recently told, quote, US propose a following compromise. Russian army would not enter part of our east and Ukrainian army would withdraw. I do not consider this fair. The question is very simple. If Ukrainian troops withdraw 5-10 kilometers, then why should Russian troops not also withdraw deeper into occupied territory? Don't you think this offer from US could be a trap for Ukrainian army, because Russian troops can just move forward inside this area, inside Donbas, under which Ukraine could also withdraw?
Well, certainly, this is one of the three issues that President Zelensky says have not been settled. But I think let's get specific on what has happened here. The issue we're talking about is 22% of the Donetsk region currently held by Ukraine. It's a fortified area. It's an important area for protection. The late October ultimatum by the Kremlin, working with Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, said, give it to Russia. Witkoff has said before, including to Zelensky in the White House, oh, people speak Russian there, so why shouldn't Russia have it? Which is a pretty silly argument. It's similar to saying that if people speak Spanish in parts of the United States, which they do, Spain should get parts of Florida and Texas and California. But anyway, this is what the late October ultimatum said. And of course, Europe and Ukraine pushed back and said, no, Ukraine's not going to give up the Donetsk. We want a ceasefire on the basis of the current front lines. So the Americans came back with a different proposal, which said, okay, we're not going to give this part of Donetsk to Russia, but we're going to make it, there's two different terms used for it, which are linked. We're going to make it a free economic zone. People can do business there, but it'll be a demilitarized zone, right? So no Russian troops, no Ukrainian troops there. And it'll be 30 kilometers deep. Now, there are a couple of problems that President Zelensky and others identified with this proposal. The first is, as you mentioned, it calls on Ukraine to effectively withdraw 30 kilometers, to move back 30 kilometers, but it doesn't call on Russia to withdraw at all from the territory it occupies. So why isn't it each side moves back 15 kilometers, right? Why not that? But secondly, who's going to provide the security in this demilitarized zone? Who's going to provide the guarantees that it's not going to be attacked again? If there's no Ukrainian forces there, is it going to be American forces? Well, absolutely not, because the Trump people will not put Americans into Ukraine. Is it going to be European forces? That's kind of risky, because the Russians will target them. If the European forces are they forces from the United Nations, from other countries? So it's a really, really vague proposal the Americans put forward. And this is why it hasn't been agreed. And in fact, I don't think it'll be agreed. What the Americans have done is the Americans still are not coming to grips with the starting point for this is. And that is, you tell Vladimir Putin, you cease fire. Look, you cease fire. We'll talk about all the other issues, the territory, the military issues, political, economic issues, but you stop the attacks. But Trump's officials aren't willing to do that. They aren't willing to force Putin to ceasefire, which is why we dance around with these other proposals, which are sometimes vague and sometimes punish Ukraine, to be honest with you.
Professor Lucas, I want to continue on the Article 5's topic. A US official told Reuters, and I quote, Article 5-like guarantee is something President Trump believes he can get Russia to accept. From your perspective, can you imagine such a scenario?
I would like to get a rainbow unicorn for Christmas, but it ain't going to happen. No, I mean, Vladimir Putin has said repeatedly that he is not going to accept foreign forces in Ukraine. And indeed, in a very, very interesting diplomatic appearance this week, Putin called European leaders piggies or piglets. So he says basically that the Europeans are destructive and they should have no role at all to play in Ukraine. Now, how do you have a NATO 5-like guarantee if the Europeans are not involved? That's not going to happen. Secondly, Russia has said repeatedly that it does not want anything that approaches a Ukrainian association with NATO, not just that it doesn't want Ukrainian membership of NATO, it doesn't want Ukraine having close links with NATO countries. How do you have a NATO Article 5-like guarantee if there are not close links between Ukrainian countries? So no, that's just, again, there are two different types of Americans that are talking here. There's one group of Americans, and you don't know most of their names because they're career officials, and they're the adults in the room. They're talking about the practical issue of what a security guarantee means. They're talking about the air power that you need, the ground forces that you need. They're talking about what you call the deconfliction mechanisms that you need to try to avoid accidental escalation. They're talking about all of this. Then you have another group of Americans who are around President Trump, Vice President J.D. Vance, who simply go out and with no regard to the specifics of what's happening in Ukraine, they put their wishes out there. We want Ukraine to do this. We want this agreement. And in this case, don't worry, Russia will agree to this. And you're going to see, and if Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner meet Kirill Dmitriev this weekend, you'll see that Russia will not agree to NATO 5, Article 5-like guarantees. But this raises the important question. When Russia rejects this, do these Trump officials say to the Russians, sorry, this is what is going to happen, or do they swing back go back into the pocket of the Kremlin like they did in late October?
My question, following Daniel's question about Donbas and some concessions, of course, Russia is demanding a full withdrawal of Ukrainian troops of Donbas, while Deputy Foreign Minister Ryabkov says Moscow won't budge on Zaporizhia and Kherson regions, which, of course, now fully in Russian constitution. What's your take on that? And is there any room left for negotiations here?
Look, the Russians, and I have to repeat this because, the Americans keep saying peace is around the corner. The Russians are being very clear here, and that is they will not stop their attacks until they get certain things. One that we've already discussed is all of Donetsk. The second, in the south of Ukraine, is we want, at the very least, recognition in fact that we hold parts of Zaporizhia and Kherson. They actually would like legal recognition of this. They actually would like people to say, oh, this is now part of Greater Russia. The fundamental that you have to insist upon is what Ukraine has set out, and that is, it is a fact that Russia occupies these areas, and that in a ceasefire, Russia will continue to occupy these areas. But Ukraine will not give up its sovereignty over these areas. This is occupied territory. Why is that important? You do not want a situation that you had after World War II, in which Germany was carved up, in which West Germany, of course, was linked to the US, to France, to the UK, but of course, East Germany was linked to Russia. You do not want that to happen. So you do not want Ukraine to give up its sovereignty and effectively say, we accept that we're being partitioned. And let me just mention to you, by the way, I find this very interesting, and I want to be interested if your viewers know this as well. The one country that I talk to, I work with them usually every week, that recognizes this is Poland. Poland's people will say, you cannot give up your sovereignty over Zaporizhia, over Kherson, over the Donbass, because which country has been repeatedly partitioned over the past few centuries? Poland has. And they fought hard to be a single country again. So it's a horrible fact that the Russian occupation will probably have to be accepted for some years. But accepting occupation is not the same as giving up sovereignty and giving up these territories, either legally or in fact, to be Russian.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says that Russia is preparing to continue its war against Ukraine next year. Also, he points to Vladimir Putin's recent remarks in Russia's Ministry of Defense. How do you read Vladimir Putin's appearance in this meeting in Russia's Ministry of Defense this week between Russian generals, Russian defense minister, and Sergei Shoigu, and also, Valery Gerasimov, Russia's head of the Russian army? How do you read this performance?
Well, let's repeat a couple of the key points out of the performance. First of all, Putin said, in line with what we're discussing, that Russia will get historic territories within Ukraine. And when he says historic territories, he is referring to the areas that we have talked about in the east and in the south, and maybe even more. Because remember, Putin has said that Odessa is historically Russian. So Putin has said, we're not stopping with the aims of this invasion. Secondly, Putin is rejecting the negotiations to end the invasion by effectively saying that certain people do not have legitimacy. The Europeans do not have legitimacy because, let's remind people, he called them piggies or piglets. In fact, he called them Nazi piggies, Nazi piglets. Which is interesting to me. I don't think Ireland is run by Nazis. I'll double check here. But he also said, of course, that the Zelensky government is illegitimate again. So again, I want to be very clear, because we've got some people that will come in on the comments and say that we're being unfair to the Russians, unfair to the Kremlin, that the Russians are just defending themselves. Putin is waging a war of aggression. And in this war of aggression, he is not going to compromise. And I'll just give you a line beyond everything we've talked about today, because I've been asked by several media outlets, look, are we going to get a ceasefire soon? It's like, well, no, I don't think so. I think the only way that Putin gives up on his objectives, which is to break Ukraine, to split it, to make Ukrainians in some parts of the country Russians, whether they like it or not. The only way he gives up on that is when he no longer has the resources to continue the invasion. It comes back to what we talked about again and again, and what we started this interview with, which is when he does not have the economic resources to carry on the invasion, then he'll stop. Until then, now this, with regret, folks, y'all got to stay strong. And Europe has to stay strong behind you. And good Americans need to stay strong as well, whatever Donald Trump does.
Another meeting today, actually, in Brussels. EU leaders are expected to decide on reparation-style loan for Ukraine. And we know that this idea was blocked not only by Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, but also by Belgium and Italy. Reuters reports that without continued EU financial support, Ukraine could run out of money next year and significantly increasing the risk of losing the war. How realistic this scenario, and what would be the consequences if the decision will be not reached today or tomorrow?
In this week, which is one of the most important during this 47-month invasion, not only are we talking about these talks between Moscow, Europe, Ukraine, and the United States, not only are we talking about the military situation, we're talking about the economic situation. And the starting point here is, just to be very clear, people, Ukraine needs about 135 billion euros over the next 2 years to cover its government finances, to cover its public services. Ukraine's taxes, you folks know this, they all go to the military to hold off the invasion. So who's going to provide that 135 billion? Well, you have to turn to the international community, and foremost amongst the international community is the Europeans, notably the European Union. So there are a couple of mechanisms to try to raise this money. And the two that are probably in play, one is to borrow the money on capital markets, but the other is to use the frozen Russian assets in Europe. There are about 210 billion euros of Russian assets held in Europe. And you can give Ukraine a loan from those assets. And the reason why you call it a reparations loan is when we finally get into this invasion, it may be that the Ukraine will have to repay that loan to the EU, but that money will be seized from the Russians for damages, the damages that they've caused Ukraine. Something, by the way, which was advanced this week in another meeting in The Hague. Now, Belgium has been the leading country to object to this. And the reason for this is because Belgium holds about 2/3 of the Russian assets, about 135 billion by coincidence, through the company Euroclear. Belgium is worried that the Russians will come after them, that the Russians could come after them legally and try to claim the money back in courts of law, or that Russia will come after Belgian companies. They'll retaliate against Belgian companies. And indeed, the Russians have been, and this was revealed by European security services this week, they've been threatening Belgian officials. They've been threatening Belgian government officials. They've been threatening Belgian executives, including the chief executive of Euroclear. So the Belgians have really been saying to the EU, you've got to protect us. You've got to cover us if this reparations loan is given. And that's why these 2 days of discussions are being held right now, today, on Thursday and Friday. And maybe by the weekend we get an agreement. But it's not only the Belgians you have to deal with here. There are other countries who have had concerns about this. Now let's leave Hungary and Slovakia to the side, because they'll never agree to this. But this decision does not require a unanimous vote. This only requires a qualified majority. What does that mean? There are countries like Italy who have said, we want to make sure that the legal framework for this is absolutely solid. What they're saying here is we want to make sure that Russia cannot claim this money back if we give it to Ukraine. The reason why that's important is the Trump administration has reportedly threatened the EU. The Trump administration has reportedly said to the EU, if you give this money to Ukraine, we will get it back. So some Trump officials, who I think are the ones who've been talking to the Russians about joint economic projects, do not want the Russian assets to be given to Ukraine, and they've been putting pressure on the Italian Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni. So let's summarize. We have Belgium's legitimate concerns. We have pressure from the Russians. We have pressure from the Americans. Can the EU deal with all three of these to get an agreement by this weekend so that Ukraine has an assurance that it has funding through the end of 2027?
My last question for today. Time reports that Russia's wartime economy is collapsing under shrinking energy revenues, loss of skilled workers, and weakening industrial base. And also, this media suggests that Putin's position is much weaker than in his rhetoric indicates it. So, given the intention to continue the war, especially as we see now next year and maybe in the future, how long can his resources realistically hold out?
You know, there's not a definitive answer to that, because I can talk you through what is a serious economic situation for Russia. We've described the sharp cut in oil and indeed gas revenues. We could add that Russia's economy has almost zero growth now. We could mention an unofficial inflation rate of 20 to 25%. We could talk about the fact that in some parts of Russia, there are shortages of resources. We could talk about the fact that in Russia, there's been a suspension of payments to people who have served in the military or to their families. So there are signs that the Russian economy is under strain. But how long can you maintain an invasion economy? We've been talking about how long Ukraine can maintain a resistance economy, right? So to simply say that Russia will stop its invasion because the economy will suddenly collapse, that's not the way that this will play out. But I think that as Russia's resources come under strain, the amount that it can give to the military, it becomes tougher for them to keep up that funding. So it is the combination of sanctions and the combination of Ukraine's attacks inside Russia that have to continue to put the squeeze on Moscow. I've always said to you that I can only guess, and I emphasize it's a guess, but I still think we probably are talking about a vital 6-month window now. I think Vladimir Putin really needs to break Ukraine by next spring. I think if he doesn't break Ukraine by next spring, I think then he's got a question about how far he can keep pushing this invasion. In terms of manpower, in terms of equipment, in terms of the finance behind it. But all I can tell you here is that that's just simply a projection. I think we just have to deal with the here and now. And the here and now here is that precisely because the time might be limited, Russia is going to step up its attacks. And you know that. You know about the attacks that you're having to endure on energy infrastructure. You know about the fact that they're making pushes not only in Donetsk, but in Zaporizhia. And so it's hard to say this as an outsider, and I am an outsider to Ukrainian people, but it is just my hope, which is just hold on, And I will, if I close this, I just want to close this just with a personal reflection beyond an analyst. And I know it will drive the trolls for the Kremlin crazy, and I don't care. Go away. The resilience of the Ukrainian people has been something that I think may be unmatched in my lifetime. You're talking about a people who've had to deal with serious domestic issues. You've had serious issues about your government. You've had serious issues about accountability and corruption in your government that you've had to deal with even during this. You've had to deal with the fact that you didn't know who would come to your assistance at certain points. In February 2022, you had to endure the nightmare that you didn't even know if your government was going to survive overnight when Russian special forces were at Hostomel Airport and were threatening to go into the capital. And there were people who I was talking to on that night when those Russian special forces were in Hostomel who said, we think Kyiv will fall within a few weeks. And you know what? The famous part of this is that President Zelensky said, I don't need a tank. I need weapons. I need ammunition. But here's the bigger part for me. Ukrainian people said the same thing. Many of them had to leave the country, but many of them stayed and they did not give up. And so I can't tell you when this invasion will end, but I can tell you that having witnessed 47 months of it, Ukraine still stands, its government still stands, and most importantly, its people still stand.
Thank you, Professor Lucas, for your kind words and insightful answers, and glory to Ukraine.
Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава. Thank you very much.